Today's lecture will be an introduction to coastal environments. Obviously, with coastal environments, there are natural processes which shape the natural landscape. You can see on the left here a very wet land up north in Queensland that has obviously been affected by its proximity to the coast. And on the right, you have the beautiful 12 Apostles here in the state of Victoria that have been formed distinctly by ocean erosion processes. On the other side of things, there's also huge human impact on coastal processes. On the left, you see the Gold Coast up in Queensland again, and on the right, you see Australia's largest city, Sydney. And as you know, much of Australia's population is located on the coast, and therefore there's a huge impact on the natural coastline by what humans build. Now, when you are looking at coastal zones, what that means is you're specifically looking at the area where the marine and continental processes interact, or where shore meets ocean, where land meets water at the ocean. And it includes land under the water, and it includes land on the fringes outside of the water. And there's a huge amount of both natural processes and human processes, as we mentioned before, that have an effect on that coastal zone. And these coastal zones are often very fragile ecosystems because the impact of all the human population that is attracted to the beach, as well as the battering that the beach can take from storms. The beach and coastal areas can take from storms, as well as the impact that humans have through fishing and pollution of the ocean in the coastal regions. These can all have huge impact on the very fragile ecosystem around the coastal area. Now, this is an image of the coastal zones, and it breaks it down. Now, I'm going to go through a couple of the terms here. When they're talking about the low tide and the high tide breaker lines, what's meant by the breaker line is where the land under the water ceases to be affected by waves at high tide or low tide. So the high tide breaker line here, when the tide is in, when the tide reaches the beach here, this high tide breaker line, below that line, there would be no effect by tide or by waves or by wave movement on the actual ground beneath the water. The low tide breaker line would be the same thing. Now, when it's talking foreshore, the foreshore is what we would call the beach area that is exposed when the tide is out. The backshore is the area of the beach that is always exposed, except potentially it can be covered at times by waves in extreme conditions. Now, what's called the coast itself, or the coastline, is that area off the beach. The coast, when they're talking the coast, is the area of land that is right up next to the beach, but does not actually include the beach or the foreshore. Now, when we're talking coastal zones, there's actually a definition of a coastal zone, and for Victoria, that coastal zone includes 3 nautical miles on the seaward, so out to sea from the mainland and from offshore islands. And the coastal zone actually includes a mile back from the high tide, or sorry, a kilometer back from the high tide marker. And as well, when you're into bays and estuaries of rivers, it includes 1 kilometer around that area as well. So for instance, in a place like Melbourne that is on a bay, it would include 1 kilometer back around the bay. So the central business district of Melbourne is essentially within the coastal zone of Victoria. Now the open coast is a bit different. So when we're talking about Melbourne, Melbourne would distinctly not be on the open coast because it is on that large Port Phillip Bay. Now the characteristics of the open coast are that it actually faces the sea. The ocean or the coastline is open to the open ocean. This area is greatly impacted by both the wave action and other movements, extreme tides, at times, cyclones, big winds, big storms. These all have a great effect on the open ocean versus Melbourne, which doesn't have that same, doesn't get the same battering from storms because the bay is so enclosed. The shoreline obviously consists of many different physical features, including coral, which is often found just off the beach. And in these areas, the flora and fauna must be very strong because it takes a battering from the open ocean, whether it's wet winds, salt, and when I'm talking about salt, I mean both in the water that's hitting it, but also in the water that it's often using for sustenance. So there's a high salinity in the soil in the area. And of course, storm surge, so the big waves that come in with big storms.